Hi guys, Sci-Fi Recapped here. Today I am going to explain the film called Surrogates. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and stay safe. In early scenes we discover that humans have built robots that will replace people in daily life. Surrogates, as they are known, are controlled by stim chairs using neuropathic signals. Humans remain safe in their own houses while their surrogates live their lives for them. As bigotry and hatred fade, crime rates fall and societal living conditions improve. However, dreads, or anti-surrogacy activists, start to launch campaigns against the robots. They accuse the surrogates of being liars and deceivers. The dreads have collected in isolated isolation zones around the planet, led by Zaire Powell. The scene moves to a wealthy young man, who is transported to a nightclub. He starts dancing with a woman and then they go to the back alley to kiss. In the process, a figure emerges and interrupts them. The man tells the figure to leave, but the couple is abruptly struck by lightning. The FBI's agents Peters and Greer arrive on the scene and discover the man and lady to be surrogates. They discover that the male surrogate is unregistered, whereas the female surrogate has been allocated to someone. But the owner hasn't filed any reports. They notice the surrogate's eyes are burned out, and Greer notices the male surrogate's memory chip is fried. Greer and Peters then go to the female surrogate's apartment, where they discover him dead with his nose bloodied. Greer examines the last thing the surrogate saw and notices the male surrogate's eyes burn and shatter before the feed is cut off. Greer then returns home and pours himself a glass of water, demonstrating that he is also a surrogate. The surrogate then enters a closet and parks. Greer then rises from his chair and goes to see his wife, Maggie. Greer suggests a vacation. However, Maggie suggests taking their surrogates to Hawaii, but Greer prefers to leave the surrogates at home and have them go out physically. In a college dormitory, some teens discover their friend, Jared, on his chair, lifeless and covered in blood. Andrew, the police chief, then informs the station of the discovery. They found that the two operators, Jared and the female surrogate operator, had their brains liquefied. Whatever happened to their surrogate seems to have killed them. Greer and Peters examine the surrogate tape and notice a man with a firearm. Greer informs Andrew that the case appears to be a homicide. They are subsequently informed via phone that Jared is the son of surrogacy pioneer Lionel Cantor, the father of surrogacy. Regrettably, he was removed from his company several years ago by his partners. Greer and Peters then pay a visit to Lionel. They're let in and met by one of Lionel's surrogates. Lionel then tells the cops the story of the dead teen, Jared. As Jared started college, his father, Lionel, offered him the use of any of his surrogates. Peters then emphasizes the significance of not enabling other users to borrow surrogates registered to other people. Greer inquires if Lionel is aware of anyone who would like to harm himself or Jared. Lionel realizes that the assassination was intended for him rather than Jared. The assassin was unaware that the person acting as Lionel's surrogate was Jared. Lionel logs out of the surrogate after realizing this. Greer and Peters then travel to the company which creates surrogates to meet with representatives. Greer inquires as to whether they are aware of any incidents involving a surrogate's head bursting and the surrogate operator dying. The representatives grow defensive, assuring Greer that there are safeguards in place to protect against such mishaps. They then make their way to the engineering floor to speak with one of the engineers. Greer shows him the fried identity chip from Jared's surrogate, and the engineer says the only way this could happen is if all of the circuits fired at the same time. The engineer also informs them that a truckload of surrogates arrived from the military, missing optics and identity chips. Greer and Peters then travel to a military base to observe surrogate troops fighting a war on the battlefield. A surrogate is shot and killed, and the operator immediately jumps back in with a different surrogate. The military colonel tells them that any weapon used on a surrogate will have no impact on the surrogate's operator. He also notes that the military routinely removes surrogate motherboards and optics for investigation. Back at the police station, Peters recognizes the man in the surveillance footage holding the firearm as non-surrogate user Miles. They then proceed to the monitoring department, where Bobby, a non-surrogate technician, informs them that Miles has been located. Greer heads up to meet with the pursuit squad, while Peters remains with Bobby to track Miles' location. Bobby then tells Peters that identifying Miles was simple because they have access to all of the city's surrogate feeds. An alarm sounds, and Bobby witnesses a man assaulting a woman. He calls it in and requests that the assailant's surrogate be shut down immediately. Bobby gets served with the disconnection warrant and quickly shuts down the surrogates. Peters is taken aback because she had no idea surrogates could be turned off remotely. Now, Peters is concerned about the program falling into the hands of the wrong people. Miles rides his motorcycle through the streets as police cars follow him. He swerves through the traffic, narrowly avoiding oncoming vehicles. Greer pursues the suspects in a helicopter. Miles is then forced to stop in an alley and is cornered. Police swarm him, and Miles pulls out a weapon, causing the pursuing officers to be blasted with an electric shock. All of the police surrogates convulse, and their eyes bulge out. He then directs the device toward the helicopter. Greer collapses and disconnects from the surrogate as swiftly as possible. Miles comes over a dread town, and the chopper begins to drift towards it as well. Greer returns to his surrogate only to find himself in the dread isolation zone. Greer emerges from the debris and begins pursuing Miles. As the dread residents notice that a surrogate has entered the zone, they become enraged and begin pursuing Greer. Greer and Miles sprint through the slums, passing several trailers. Greer easily leaps over trailers and climbs them until he catches up to Miles. Greer demands that Miles hand up the weapons, and Miles obliges by handing Greer a bag. Greer was blown away by a shotgun blast before he could unzip the bag. Miles takes the firearm back, and Greer is shot by a lady who calls him an abomination. Greer walks away from his surrogate, and out of his stimming chair, he crawls over the floor, screaming out to Maggie. She soon locates Greer and calls an ambulance. Miles later awakens to find the Prophet, Powell, and his men ransacking his home in search of the weapon. Powell inquires about the origin of the weapon, and Miles admits that he never found out who it belonged to. According to a news story, Powell interpreted the wrecked helicopter as an attack on the Dread's house and started a revolution against surrogate users. Meanwhile, Greer awakens in the hospital, and Adam informs him that he has been suspended. Adam says he'll handle the case himself and tells Greer to relax. Greer flees the hospital, enraged at the Bureau's decision. He is concerned that the Bureau will not share his fear about Miles' weapon. Peters immediately meets him, and they begin their journey back to the station. Greer becomes dizzy and disoriented as he walks. According to Peters, it's a side effect of being in the surrogate for too long. Greer chooses to go visit the Dread colony, assuming he'll be able to get in easily now that he's not using a surrogate. Within, he sees his surrogate crucified and learns that Miles is no longer alive. Powell talks during Miles' funeral, reminding the attendees that Miles' death, unlike the surrogates, is a symbol of true humanity. Greer approaches Powell after the burial, but when he refuses to leave, Powell's thugs beat him up. Later, Greer inquires about the weapon, but Powell laughs and responds sarcastically. Greer departs, and Powell enters his trailer to grab the weapon lying beneath the floor. Greer gets into a car that has pulled up behind him. A young boy reveals that he is another of Lionel's surrogates. After the assassination attempt, Lionel claims he can't utilize his normal surrogates. Greer informs Lionel that Jared's assassin has been murdered by Powell. Lionel then tells him to focus on finding the weapon. They'll know who wanted Lionel dead if they figure out where the weapon came from. According to Lionel, the Dreads are incapable of creating such a weapon because it would necessitate extensive research and funding. Greer then returns home and has an altercation with Maggie. He wants to see his real wife, not a surrogate. Maggie then enters her room and looks in the mirror. She removes her goggles and sobs on her stimming chair. Greer returns to the station and discovers that the company creating the surrogates has signed a weapon deal with the military. Later that night, a surrogate enters Peter's house. It examines recordings of what Peters has seen and discovers information on Bobby and the police's capacity to tap into all surrogates. The surrogate then repeatedly shoots a sleeping Peters. It then implants a remote operator into Peters' surrogate. Peters' surrogate comes to life at the station. The next day, Greer meets with the military colonel and shows him a picture of the weapon. The colonel admits to knowing about the weapon's existence and reveals that it's an overload device designed for the military. However, all prototypes were thought to have been destroyed after the testing phase. Greer then informs the colonel that the Dreads have obtained the weapon. The colonel immediately rushes out and informs Greer that the military will be in charge of retrieving the weapon. Powell passes the weapon to his henchmen in the terror zone and orders them to deliver it to Peters at the police station. Meanwhile, Greer visits Maggie's salon and wants to talk about what is happening between them. Maggie reminds Greer that the only reason she is still living today is because of her surrogate, who gave her an escape from her life. At home, Maggie grabs a bottle of pills from a stack and takes one. Meanwhile, the military has begun an assault on the Dread Zone in order to recover the weapon. Troops pour out of helicopters as the terrified residents flee to safety. Powell and his henchmen attempt to flee but are apprehended by soldiers. A gunfight breaks out between Powell's men and the military, but Powell's men are quickly overpowered. Powell is shot, and when the military approaches, they notice that Powell, the anti-surrogacy movement's leader, is himself a surrogate. Lionel is finally identified as Powell's operator. Greer meets with the surrogate, whom he believes is Peter, and learns that Miles has been working with Andrew. Miles had been paid by Andrew to assassinate Lionel. Greer then enters the station to confront Andrew about what he has discovered. As Andrew looks away, Greer stabs the surrogate in the back of the skull, knocking it out. He then gains access to Andrew's computer and downloads anything related to the company creating surrogates and Miles. He then meets Peter's surrogate and drives away. Greer deduces from the files that Lionel is funding the anti-surrogacy movement. Greer then discovers the codes required to activate the weapon. Peters then calls the station to inform them of Greer's location. A truck hits them at that moment, and the automobile is tossed. Greer decides to pursue Peters and try to run her over as she walks away with the weapon. They end up driving through congested streets, running over surrogates, and colliding with other cars. Greer crashes into a store window, but Peter escapes. Greer flees the pursuing FBI agents and steals a car. He phones Bobby and orders him to shut down Peter's surrogate. But Peters is already there, and Bobby informs Greer that she is attempting to access the entire surrogate network. Andrew walks up to the monitoring level and confronts Peters. He attempts to communicate with Peters, but Lionel shows that he is in control of Peter's surrogate. Andrews tells Lionel that they were forced to kill him because he tried to stop the surrogates. Lionel goes on to claim that he merely wants people to live like humans. He then shoots the weapon at Andrew, shorting out and destroying his surrogate's computer. Greer arrives at Lionel's house and insists on speaking with the real Lionel. He then forces his way in, looking for Lionel. Meanwhile, Peter's surrogate launches a virus upload into all surrogates with the intention of killing everyone who uses a surrogate. Greer discovers a secret door and penetrates it to reach Lionel's chamber. He finds many surrogates in the room, including Powell and the man who murdered Peters. Greer then discovers Lionel in a wheelchair, aiming a gun at him. Lionel believes that surrogacy has become a distortion of mankind and a horrible obsession. A warning tone signals that the virus upload has been completed. Now that he has reached his goal, Lionel takes his own life by swallowing a cyanide pill. Greer then removes Lionel from the stimming chair and enters Peter's surrogate. He asks Bobby how they can stop the virus from spreading, and Bobby walks him through the process. Greer successfully pauses the transmission with less than a second remaining. Although the operators are safe, the virus is still active and would kill surrogates. While a team of operatives enters the facility, Bobby educates Greer on how to protect the surrogates from being destroyed. Greer pauses as he is about to finalize the virus termination, and instead decides to allow the virus to be transferred to surrogates. An operator shoots Peter's surrogate as Greer presses the button. As the virus becomes active, all of the surrogates become lifeless. Greer emerges to discover that the virus has successfully incapacitated all surrogates, and people begin to emerge from their homes confused. Greer returns home and discovers his wife standing at the window. Maggie kisses Greer on the cheek, and the two embrace. Humanity has returned to the world, uncertain of what lies ahead. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit that like button to help our channel grow. Turn on the notifications so you won't miss any of our new videos.